Brad.
Yeah,
to kick
so,
off.
I might grab the clicker, thanks Chris. So the phone rings. It's Sandy on the phone, and she's rung and hang on, who's Sandy? That's right, I did a little bit of life cover work for Sandy. She's in her 30s, just had kids, done the right thing, wanted to secure the future, but such a small interaction with the client that we didn't think much of it. But there's been a terrible accident, and so she's explaining this to you, and it slowly unfolds the ramifications of what this accident's going to mean for her life, and potentially for your practice. So it turns out that what you didn't realise, because she's just been working in the city on a salaried job, starting a new family, but one generation back, and her brother or sister, they're working on a family farm. Net worth $30 million. And whoop. What does that mean? Well, in the accident, her father's passed away and her brother's totally and permanently disabled. So now she's got to step up and help the family deal with not only the death, but how do we get our arms around this $30 million? I'm Brad Loftus. As per the introduction, I'll now hand over to Chris, and we'll step you through what we're going to cover today.
Thanks, Brad. So today we're going to cover what to do when you do land a prospective high net worth client, some of the issues that you may face, how you can target high net worth clients, and also hopefully we can provide you with a couple of key takeaways for today. So we do have a poll just to start things off. Does everyone know how to access the poll? So you've got to select today's session and scroll down to the poll question. So the first poll, is it poll question up there, or do I need to click through? I'll click through. Poll question, here we go. So does anyone call themselves a family office or claim to provide family office services, or none of the above? I know a few years ago it was actually a bit of a buzzword. A lot of people were talking about being a family office, and it became, really just one of those buzzwords. I'm not sure if everybody really truly meant what family office meant. So we'll just wait for those to come through. There we go, I might have to step over here and just have a quick look at what the results are. So none of the above. I think that's a much better result from some of the anecdotal commentary that was going around a few years ago. I think every second person was trying to be a family office or wanted to be some sort of family office. So, yeah. All right, we'll move on from that if we can. All right. So I might hand over to Brad on this one.
So I think one of the key points of today's session is that looking after a high net worth family can come from all kinds of backgrounds. And the key is that depending on how they came upon their wealth, it could be through an inheritance, it could be like Sandy, that example that I gave you at the beginning, where all of a sudden you've got someone who's just at the moment thinking about how do I start a family, all of a sudden they're looking after $30 million worth of assets. That could come through a business sale. Someone that's been really good at their trade or really good at running a business, and now they're looking to transfer through to retirement by offloading that asset. But the point is they're going to have different circumstances on how they control their wealth. They're going to have different levels of education around managing that wealth and what they want to do with it. And they're going to have different family circumstances. And so, or it could be a divorce settlement. So it's all about gauging and working out what your strategy is for playing to the circumstances, not just having a cookie cutter approach.
Absolutely. There's probably three things to consider here in considering, can I actually advise this client? we've probably all heard of the wholesale sophisticated investor certificate, and we all know that as a wholesale client, $250,000 of income over the last 2 consecutive years, that's on the tax return. $2.5 million in net assets. I think most people these days recognise that if you own your own home, you've probably, if you're in a big city, probably meet that test. And $500,000 being invested into one single product. There's some technicalities around that. There's also sophisticated investor tests, not as frequently used, but things like the knowledge test, or are they a professional investor, or are they an AFSL holder? One of the things that I think gets missed here on the wholesale test is informed consent. Just getting the accountant's certificate, is the client actually aware of what the accountant has just signed them up to? It's a really important part of the process. It needs to be documented, and be it meeting notes or other processes that you need to go through. The final question is, do I have the expertise? And it comes back to what Brad was just saying. There's a whole range of different circumstances that could bring about a scenario, but do you actually have the expertise to deal with that particular question that the client is bringing forward to you? So, there is a compliance aspect. And we all know the FASEA standards. Don't ask me to rattle them off, all of them. I'm certainly not going to go through all 12. But standard 1, it was actually used, I think, in the FASEA exam, where the example was where advisors were potentially using the wholesale sophisticated test to circumvent the law. And finally, on standard 4, as I was just saying before, obtaining the accountant's certificate is not enough to satisfy the code. It's informed consent. And I've seen this before. I've seen where clients have been treated as a wholesale client, they've been sold a product, they didn't understand the product, and it's gone wrong. And they're sitting there going, well, I didn't understand this. Why was I sold this product? Why am I treated as a wholesale client? Should I be treated as a wholesale client? Are all sorts of factors that need to be considered. So, I think we've got another poll question here. All right. This is one of my all-time great questions. What is a high net worth client? You see the term bandied around. There's high net worth clients, ultra high net worth clients, the 1% club, all that sort of stuff. But, what is a high net worth client? And so I've got new glasses and they're really good, but I still can't read this from over here. 1 million plus, right? Yep. 5 million plus, 10 million plus. I assume we're all talking about investable assets here, because if you exclude the family home, the motor vehicle, because we've all got $1 million Ferraris, I think $5 million in investable assets, liquid, investing into the market, or that's under advice. We're not talking about they've got an investment property as well. Yeah, $5 million plus. I think that's high net worth. I think it's higher than the average person for sure. And $10 million plus, I think you're certainly getting up there for sure. So I think that's interesting. What is high net worth? I mean, some people I've heard before, $500,000 is high net worth, isn't it? But each to their own. Okay, let's move forwards from that one, hopefully.
Well, it's an interesting question, though, especially with property prices going the way they are. It's not that far off.
Absolutely. Can we move forwards from that? Thank you. Okay. So, let's just have a look at some of the client needs, and you can really break this down into, there are 3 key areas that every client needs. You need an accountant. You've got to do your tax return. That's pretty part and parcel of everything that we do. But accountants do more than just doing the tax return. There's a lot of consulting work. You need a solicitor, okay, your estate planning work, etc., etc. And you need your financial advisor, financial strategy and investment advice. Now, we could break this out into more service providers, absolutely. But broadly speaking, these are the 3 key pillars for every client, ultimately, at the end of the day. Some of you may have actually seen this chart before. So this chart, it's actually quite old. It originally came from the Myer family office, but it's been updated and rehashed over the years. But this is sort of the building blocks of, what are a client's needs? So as a client's wealth grows, so does the complexity. And as you can see on each of these building blocks, obviously each row is the same, but each column you're building on the complexity that a client needs. So those service providers, the accountant, the solicitor, the financial advisor, and the issues that a high net worth clients face just continue to grow. When you get right to the top there on the family office advisory, we're talking about governance of that family. These sorts of things start to get very complicated. They're above and beyond what a normal accountant does. They're above and beyond what a normal financial advisor does. This is when you get really into those family office specialist services. The majority of us don't play in that space. Royston Capital, for example, plays in the middle column. Brad, where would you say you play?
Yeah, in the middle column.
Yep. So look, as that complexity grows, as that wealth grows, that complexity grows, and so do the issues. Brad, there's some new issues.
Yeah, what we've noticed, the ATO came out a couple of years ago, and with their list, they said, we're going to target the first 500. And so that's the first 500 most wealthy family groups private family groups that they've recognised in Australia. So they're now collecting data from all over, sharing data across the state jurisdictions to track property values. They've obviously got, they know what shareholdings people have. They've got it all. And it was interesting for one of these families, Mum was passed away. We were trying to work out what the value of the business was for her estate, and the client asked me, well, we're about to do the probate application. We've got to put the value of the shares down on Mum's probate application. Can the ATO see that court filing? Turns out the ATO can get information from anywhere if they so desire. So just assume that they know. Now they're stepping down into what they call the next 5,000, and so we're starting to increasingly help these large family groups and wealthy family groups with a scheduled engagement with the ATO every couple of years. And now we're starting to see an expectation from the ATO around what's your tax governance policy. And so that's not just, that then goes beyond just have a good accountant and do what they say, which is probably what keeps accountants up at night anyway. But also, do you understand, as the directors of these companies, as the controllers of this wealth, what you are doing from a tax point of view, which comes down to, well, what are your policies around and expectations in the family around understanding the outcome, the tax outcome, and the strategies being put in place.
Yeah, no doubt. As the wealth grows and the complexity grows, so does the scrutiny. So you've got to become more and more diligent in how you apply things, and that's where, working together, you tend to make sure that, you scrutinise it yourself as well. So, look, one of the things that Royston Capital is not, and one of the things that RSM is not, we are not a family office. I mean, I could argue that Royston Capital is, we deal with family money, but we're not a family office. We do provide services into family offices, but we don't call ourselves a family office. One of the things that we do is we bring a lot of experts into the room. We don't try to do it all ourselves. We know we can't. So we're always looking to introduce those specialists into the group, into the discussion, bring them in around the boardroom table and have that discussion with the family group. So we bring in RSM, for example, to talk about the tax planning, the structuring, the issues with Div 7A, and all these sorts of things. There's no way in the world I'm going to deal with Div 7A. I've had it explained to me a few times, and that's enough. I'll leave that to the accountant, and the accountant tells me then what to do. So we are definitely not any one of these family office types. And there are multiple types. Lots of different firms out there claim to be family offices, and they are in very, very different guises. They serve very different purposes. And the reality is, from our perspective, I assume pretty much everybody in this room is a financial planner or advisor of some shape or form, is that you don't need to be a family office to be able to provide services to a high net worth individual. And you may not be providing it just to them, in that you may be providing a limited number of services to them, which we're going to talk about, I believe. Some recent research, so I sit with another family office called the Boyce Family Office, and they have been doing some more research into why various high net worth clients seek advice. So we know that we've now established the advisors here can actually provide the advice. We've been through that process, wholesale, we've got informed consent, and yes, we're happy we can provide the advice that the client is after. And these are the reasons they're probably coming to you. So estate and wealth transfer, ensuring the efficient and fair transfer of wealth between, of family assets between family members. So avoiding leakage to third parties. We've seen it a lot. I'm not sure, does everyone remember the Pratt family when he passed away, and his mistress who came out of the woodwork? Yep. So that's, these things do happen. Tax and legal advisory, so, leveraging the specialist tax advisors and lawyers to avoid that tax leakage where it's unnecessary. Wealth management, obviously, this is a key area that a lot of the advisors would be able to provide, great services in. So that's assistance in managing the family's financial assets and creating solutions and structures that are suitable for that client to ensure there's a sound investment process in place. Family governance is another key area that they seek. So capable successors are selected to take on the roles of their predecessors. A lot of this happens when they've got operating businesses as well. So you have an operating business, and then you might have your family office, and you've got succession planning going on across both of these entities. Who's running the business now? Have you brought in external management team? Who's running the family office and who's succeeding up through there? These are issues that are very, very big for large family groups. They're not issues that you necessarily have to deal with though. You just need to be aware of them and know who's going to be dealing with those issues and how they might impact the advice you provide. What's the final one here? The rising generation, training and education. So again, as families become wealthier, the issue of the next generation, and I'm not sure if you've all heard about it, but the third generation is the troublesome one. So the first generation makes the money, the second generation grew up knowing about the hardship of making that money, the third generation's always had money and just likes to spend it. And it's happened throughout history. The third generation is the one that blows the money, but the ones with the family office are the ones that have trained them and educated them about that money, and they're the ones that you're seeing generations 6, 7 and 8 in family offices in Melbourne, for example. They're the ones that are being successful with that training and education. So Brad, what is the answer here?
Yeah, well, it's pretty well telegraphed answer. I think it's to get your panel of advisors. So these people in your professional network that you trust to know how they can help and what expertise they bring to these family situations. It's an interesting one. In South Australia, we've got a prominent family, the Cooper family, that you'd all know from their brewing business. They've been facing these challenges for generations. And they've put in mechanisms themselves, but they haven't done it in isolation. They've brought that group together. And just as you were talking about that, Chris, they actually don't let one of the younger family members into the family business until they're 30 and they've gone and spent some time elsewhere. But they've got big challenges in trying to keep the business running, which is a strong family business, but then also keep that non-business wealth and governance separate. and in good health. So yeah, it's about building that team that's going to support you to when that phone call comes for that big wealth event, to understand the situation and play to the situation, not just play to the dollars.
Yeah. Balanced advice, well-rounded.
Yep.
Education for unsophisticated families and risk management. They're all key factors. So, there's the Cooper family brewery, there's the Bogue family brewery. One has survived in the family, one has not. So there is success and there is failure. Is it failure? Well, it depends. Depends on the approach.
All right. So what I'm going to do now is just take an opportunity to discuss some just structuring considerations. We've probably got a pretty diverse group in the room today. And I think I'm fading in and out a little bit. And so there'll be some, I won't go over the motherhood stuff around some of this structuring. I'm going to talk about some self-managed super fund, discretionary family trust considerations, using the governance of trusts to your advantage, and potentially using corporate beneficiaries. We don't have time today to go through all that, but I wanted to bring to your attention, I think for the first time in a long time in my career, we're seeing the ATO and the federal government flex their muscle a little bit more, because obviously we've spent a lot of money over the pandemic and they need to try and get some tax dollars in to reduce the deficit, but then build for the future, because we're going to have a big public bill for managing a retiring generation. So that's what we're looking at. So self-managed super funds, we know the fundamentals, great place to invest. We've got 15% tax rate at worst, unless we've got Div 293. We know that they need to deal at arm's length. So what you're going to find is when one of these families comes to you, there's likely going to be a self-managed super fund. Some of you will utilise them, some might just use more public products, but knowing that the family needs to deal at arm's length. They're very popular with commercial property. I do a little bit of work in the farming space, so I've got a lot of clients that have moved some blocks of land in there and they just rent it off the self-managed super fund as part of their business. But it works quite well in that wealth accumulation phase. It does become a little bit problematic during pension phase to have such a chunky asset in super. And it is possible to gear investments, but the banks have gone off that. None of the big four banks provide like a ready-to-go lending for super funds, so it's only really the B tier that provide that. What I wanted to talk about was this, which won't be news to any of you. From 2025, we're expecting to see that taxation on members with super balances over $3 million, an additional 3% in the growth in value of the super. Now, it's important to note that this is just draft legislation at the moment. It hasn't been legislated. But it's on the cards. And as a firm, our view, especially from our super team, is the fact that this is likely to go through. The Greens are playing games at the moment because they want their super guarantee on maternity leave payments or parental leave payments. But it's likely to go through because if the coalition were to get in the next election at latest could be May 2025. So if it doesn't pass Parliament by then, but we don't really see, because this affects the high net wealth people in Australia, it's going to affect less than 5%. They're already voting for the coalition anyway. And the coalition need the money. So maybe we're too cynical as a firm, but this is going to be a big one. And so I think the reason I talked about self-managed super funds and the properties in there is we're probably going to see a big exodus of land coming out of super funds, just because if you've got, say, a $4 million farm piece of property and it goes up, it's had a good run on recently because of low interest rates, but if that was to go up by $500,000, then all of a sudden our clients need to find that extra out of their own money because they can't just lift the lease because it's a chunky asset. They're going to want to move those chunky assets out of self-managed super. Binding death benefit nominations, we need to just get our arms around those. It goes without saying, because with these families, it's going to be risk management. And so that'll be understanding who's going to control that wealth in the event of the worst. And getting back to my beginning example, understanding Sandy's going to have to run around and work out where Dad's wealth's going to be because he tragically passed in that car accident. And then death benefits tax, if only we knew when we're going to die. That's the leakage to that third party. It's not just to an aggrieved former spouse or a mistress or whatever the male equivalent of a mistress is, pardon me.
Mister,
yeah.
Sure.
It's also the tax office. We don't want to be leaving money on the table. Now, discretionary trusts, they're good, they provide flexibility, but they can actually be a really good way to move generational wealth between generations without incurring stamp duty, which can often only be done on death, and a good way to delay capital gains tax. We're blessed here in South Australia, we don't actually have a sunset on most of our family trusts. And so they can just go on within the family's control. But it's all about when does the control pass and how do you pass it to ensure that it goes where it needs to go. And it can get difficult if you've got multiple children that you want to have an interest in controlling those assets. You just need, if they don't get along, then maybe you will need to take stock of how that control passes. But hoping for the best in a will can be a disaster, especially when there's a lot of zeros at the end. Now, finally, the ATO have released what we call a practical compliance guide. There's a lot of commentary on it, especially in my world. You don't have to put up with it, which is good. But basically, the ATO have a mandate at the moment to ensure that when income is distributed from a discretionary trust, we often call them family trusts, that the financial benefit of those distributions follow through to the beneficiary. I've just used the word flexibility here. This is the number one vehicle over the last couple of generations for mum and dad to make sure they pay a lot less tax, especially when they've got uni students living at home mooching off them, and they want to use the kids' marginal tax rate. Now the ATO's got a mandate. They want to make sure, and their position in this practical compliance guide is that that cash has to go to the child within 2 years. The courts may have a different view on this. They have a more practical view on how this all works from a legal perspective, but the ATO need to raise money, and they're leaning on, well, what is the duty of care of the trustees? They're setting aside this income for these beneficiaries. Is it actually flowing? So control of a trust, making sure that you're across, but in particular, your clients are across. Who's the trustee? What's their role? So that's basically the administrator of the trust. And who's going to step into that role in the event of untimely death? It's also identifying what is the trust property and has that been documented right, because often that is the problem. These agreements haven't been executed correct, and maybe the asset isn't in the control. And then who's going to benefit from these? And this gets down to the allocation of income I just talked about. But really, when it comes down to it, it's who's the appointor? Because the appointor can fire the trustee. That's their one job, is to appoint the trustee. So getting down to business and making sure your clients understand the trust, and it all comes down to the trust deed. That's the rule book, and they're all different. So you can't just assume when it comes to trusts. Okay, so I've just got a few points here. I know time is ticking away. So we often recommend that a corporate trustee is put in place for a trust. part of the reason is if it is a natural person that is the trustee and they pass away, you have to wait for probate to be issued. And there's nothing that can be done in relation to those assets until that's done. But at least if you've got a corporate trustee, you can appoint directors and keep the ball moving. And then bad paperwork. If you've got a sole purpose trustee, then you're saved from bad paperwork. If you've got people wearing multiple hats, trustee of 5 different trusts, and they have the assets in their own name, then it can be a problem. All right. And then finally, I'll spin through this one very quickly. Chris mentioned Div 7A. Look out. These are obligations that people owe back to their companies. If that situation we started the conversation with today, with father passing away, if he owes money to a company, his estate's got to come up with that cash and repay the company, which can be a problem. We do use them from time to time as beneficiaries of trusts, because you can actually use Div 7A to your advantage, pay tax today at 25% or 30%, and then become the banker for your future investments. But that's something that I'll just plant the seed, because I think we've got to move things along.
Very good. Yeah, let's move on to the next slide, hopefully. There we go. So look, when it comes to investing for those higher net worth clients, the reality from my perspective is we see a lot of direct equity investment for a lot of obvious reasons, I guess, but it doesn't exclude the use of managed funds or property syndicates, etc. Not everything needs to be invested in direct equities, as an example. In fact, the reality is that just because a client has a lot of money doesn't mean they're overly sophisticated. There are some family offices where the next generation is investing exclusively in indexed managed funds, keeping it simple. So managed funds are quite often the solution of choice. You quite often, when you come across a higher net worth client, looking to balance that portfolio against other assets, and quite often have a very significant direct property holding or an operating business. That could be an ASX listed entity as well. So you might have a portfolio that is 50% one stock that you've just got to deal with. They can't just all of a sudden go and sell that. They've got to make a market announcement, etc. There's restrictions, so on and so forth. So these are all sorts of issues that you've got to balance up for that client. It's about building out the diversification away from those assets sometimes. The other one is administration. Some clients like to hide behind the custodian. They don't want their name popping up on the register. And for many instances, they have a significant holding. It might be, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% of a company. It might be a small cap. It's not hard to get there. And they like to hide behind the custodian. They don't want people to know that they're a significant investor in that particular business. They don't want to create waves. They're not there for any particular ulterior motive, so they like to hide. Others, however, prefer the simplicity of having the assets in their own name, removing the legal custodian and investing directly in their own name. So that then becomes an administrative issue, and how you deal with the administration of those assets. So you need to have the appropriate systems in place to be able to deal with that efficiently and effectively. So depending on what your business's skill set is, you may find, however, that you're actually dealing with only one part of the total portfolio. You might not be dealing with absolutely everything here. So you could be providing advice in just one section. Maybe it is just the ASX listed share portfolio. Maybe it is a selection of managed funds. Maybe it is just the self-managed super fund. It doesn't have to be the whole picture. You might be one of several advisors that specialise in a certain field. Maybe you've provided the technical advice around superannuation and somebody else is being employed to do the Aussie equity portfolio, the international portfolio, the fixed income portfolio, the term deposits, whatever it might be. You're just one piece of the bigger pie. But there's nothing wrong with that. It's still a very good job to have. So it's not something to worry about. You might be just providing a small part of the bigger picture. Probably one of the ways to sort of bring this home is really to look at some case studies. Well, just one. And this is, we had several clients last financial year come to us after having sold a business. 3 of them out of one business, another out of another business, and more recently we had another 2 sell an oil and gas type of business. Now, a group of these, we came from a sale, well, all of these in fact were sales of businesses that were more than $6 million. They all had a combination of working and non-working children. They had superannuation balances below $500,000. So these are high net worth clients, some might say ultra high net worth in different cases. But because they were so focused on building their business, they hadn't been really contributing to their superannuation funds. Sale proceeds came through in probably, depending on the business, it was either 1 or 2 tranches plus an earnout, meeting the performance criteria over the following 12 months. And in every case, the second tranche of the payout from the sale was payable after the CGT liability was due. So in one case, we're actually short on cash to pay the CGT liability until a month later when the next tranche comes through and they're flush with cash again. Structure's already in place. Doesn't mean they were right. Doesn't mean they weren't without mistakes. We found lots of errors in the estate planning side of things and their wills in particular about the documentation around their actual corporate and discretionary trust structures. So we had wrong names and all sorts of things in place. So there's a lot of tidy up to go on there. They all have Div 7A loans. And I said, that's great, that's wonderful. I'm sure the accountant is doing well with that. And because they're all now flush with cash, they've all now paid out those Div 7A loans. So what they now have is a really interesting scenario because their superannuation balances were so low, catch-up contributions. Who would have thought with a high net worth client that you're actually going to be dealing with 5 years worth of concessional catch-up contributions? Yet it does happen. This is all financial planning 101. And it's a high net worth client. Non-concessional contribution program because their balances are low. We set up investment loans because they've got tax liabilities coming through. We've got investment loans that we've set up, prepaid the interest. There's a benefit. Yep, interest rates have just gone from 0 to 6. But there's a benefit to be made here. One was a pure investment loan. The other was a protected equity loan over a couple of years. Different strategies. Repayment of the Div 7A loan. You've now got assets sitting in a corporate beneficiary, capped at 30% tax rate. That was advice from the accountant. Let's pay out the loan. We don't need this anymore. Great. We've now got a new entity that is tax effective that we're going to invest with. Family trust distributions. Now, this is a tricky area because of the new rules that Brad was talking about earlier, under the scrutiny that the ATO is now putting onto these distributions. So things like, I think it was sort of like round robin distributions where the money was going out, coming back in. It was really just a tax dodge. We've documented here distributions to the children. We've paid out of those distributions a concessional contribution to super for those kids. They didn't have a super fund prior to this, they're over 18. So 180,000 income, less a full concessional contribution to super, and the balance is sitting there and documented for a house deposit in the future. That present entitlement has a particular purpose. It's not there for the parents to use because kids have paid tax on it, because that is what the ATO is going to be looking at. The kids have a legal entitlement to it, and it is documented as well.
And that's an interesting one. The term the ATO is using there is what's ordinary family dealings. And that's, I think they've got their view, but it's going to be decided in court. And it could be we're accumulating this for a house deposit.
Absolutely. And, $150,000 for a house deposit isn't really going to cut it in a capital city at the moment. So you can do this over a few years, likely, as long as the ATO doesn't kick up a stink about it. Look, depending on different clients, some will like to have a philanthropic objective here as well. So that can be relatively simple in terms, look, a lot of clients will be just giving to the Salvation Army, so to speak. We tend to look at this as a more structured program. This doesn't necessarily mean we're going out there and setting up PAFs, private ancillary funds, or anything like that. We quite often will use a group like Australian Communities Foundation. It's relatively simple and straightforward, but that meets the client's objective. We've also got a tax deduction brought forward. The client was already making donations, so they've now brought forward that deduction for this year because of their significant CGT liability, and they're now on a program of, okay, let's distribute this money out over the next few years. Now they can build on that, that's okay, and it may continue to give for a long period of time. It's a great little strategy. It's a big win for them, tax-wise, and for their overall philanthropic objective. So what we really want to move on to now, and we'll get into targeting clients. We need to go another slide. Because this is sort of where we get to that key takeaway. And I think you've probably already got the gist of what the key takeaway is here. Focus on your strengths. So for Royston Capital, for example, we focus in on what we do best, which is, for our perspective, it's about investing. It's a long-term investment program. And the administration of those assets. Most of our clients are non-custodial. So there's a lot of work that goes into that administration of that. An outcome of that investment focus is obviously a capability to deal with the broader financial planning or wealth advice and other areas, and also bringing in those specialists. For Brad?
Yeah, well, I'm typical of most accountants that focus on private family groups, but maybe not in the capital city. I'm based here in Adelaide, but as I mentioned, half my clients are farming clients. And so Chris has just described a couple of my clients perfectly. Asset rich, but super balances of $40,000. So there's great opportunities there, but the whole point being, it's when the phone rings or you bring on this client, you've got to take stock. Make sure you play to your strengths, identify those opportunities, but bring in the estate lawyers to make sure that everything's set up right. But when it comes down to it, do what you do well and know what you don't know.
Yep, look, that's it. So hopefully we've sort of demystified this a lot, and really just bringing that back to the key point here is what you really need to do is stick to your area of expertise. That is why the client's coming to you in the first place. That's why they're there. So you don't need to go and try and do something else, and don't be afraid, to bring in another expert. I always try to bring in somebody like Brad. Brad's based in Adelaide, I'm based in Melbourne, so it's not always Brad. But other lawyers, we're always bringing in the lawyers, the accountants, etc. Bring them in around the table. Your client values those specialists as well.
Lovely. Thank you, Chris and Brad. Let's go a round of applause. Now, we do have some mics to go around, but I've already seen lots of questions coming through, so we'll start with these first. I've got one from Harry. Let's start with the meaty one. How do you deal with conflicts across generations, given the code states to avoid conflicts?
I'm sorry, can you just repeat that again? Sorry.
How do you deal with conflicts across generations, given the code states to avoid conflicts?
I'm not sure if that's directed to me or Brad, but look, conflicts do come up across generations. We're dealing with one client at the moment whom has realised significant wealth, has a large holding in a ASX-listed entity. One son is the CEO of that entity now. The other son is doing other things. They wish he was working in the business, and there's a bit of friction there at the moment. In fact, one of the businesses he's involved is actually financial planning. He's also a lawyer and is involved in insurance and law and a few other bits and pieces. Completely different to what the other business is. Sometimes it's just something you've just got to roll with over time. We haven't had any significant conflicts recently where I can think of a great example to answer that question more directly. I'm sorry.
For me, it's I actually, within the last fortnight, declined an invitation from that third generation to act as their accountant because I was acting as the accountant for the father. He was recently divorced, and what they were looking to achieve would have been not in his best interest if I was to jump on board and help them do what they wanted to do. And so I just had to say no. That's an extreme example, but and in the end, on the full knowledge that they might find an advisor that Dad likes, and I might lose the client.
So leaving it up to the client. So this is a good question. I like this one. Can you talk us through how you price your advice?
Right. This is an interesting one. I've always held a slightly different model, I think, to probably the norm for most financial planners. And that norm has been shifting over the years with, as advice has evolved. We essentially provide three services to our clients. There's insurance advice. We don't specialise in insurance. Insurance is still on a commission basis. We are looking to move to a fee for service on that. We provide what we refer to as wealth advice, so the broader financial strategic planning. It's at an hourly rate. We try to quote that up front and say we're probably not very good at that. We seem to always underestimate our hours. But we do record our hours accurately. We have a timekeeping tool for that specifically. And we provide investment advice. And our investment advice we provide as a funds management type service. So it's a scaled percentage of funds under advice. It's as simple as that. We don't do scaled services.
Okay. I'll combine these two questions. They're kind of similar. So what level assets do you both consider requires to be wealth advisory, which is one category that you had, and family office services? Because you had investment advisory, wealth advisory, and family office services. How much assets do you need to be in the last two?
Wealth advisory and that middle column that we sort of play in, that's really just the service proposition more than anything else, and I think every advisor in this room can play in that middle section, regardless of the level of wealth that a client has. To me, that's just the way I break down the services. So the wealth advice is the strategic financial planning, and the investment advice and administration, to me, is just another service. But depending on how you structure your firm, it might be another tier. It might be ticking up in terms of the total level of funds that a client is dealing with or the services that they want. To move into that family office space, I'm just trying to sort of go back through some recent conversations with some other family offices who actually deal specifically in that space. And I think you're really talking about sort of 50 to 100 million type of range when you're starting to deal with, the corporate governance. So you've probably got that operating entity that's been in the family group for a while, probably at least moving into the second generation that are interested in running that business, and you're generating, significant wealth outside of that as well. So look, you're probably not going to have your own family office under $50 million of investable assets. But once you start moving in that sort of $50 to $100 million range, you're certainly, well and truly embedded in the service requirements. And if you're not, you probably do need them. Brad, I'm not sure. What are you seeing from a tax?
Yeah,
you probably see a little bit more of it than...
Yeah, I would have thought, whilst there's a correlation between wealth and the need, it'd be down to the need to be driven by sophistication and complexity, and or the lack of sophistication, what the family actually needs and what they need to protect and who they need to protect it from.
Okay.
Quite often that family office evolves from the business being the family office and the business, And eventually, as that wealth grows and the business grows, you need to start separating family from the business. And that's when sort of the family office starts to sort of evolve. But, again, if I bring it back to you as an audience here, as broader financial advisors, it's not something I'd be overly concerned about. It's good to know, though.
This next one was brought up in the CFP Connect session yesterday, and I think this would be a good one from Aaron. How do you deal with issues around identifying who your client is with family offices?
I haven't actually had any issues with identifying our client. Quite often when we're dealing with providing a service to a family office, it might just be a couple of members of that family office seeking some advice around their self-managed super fund. Us investing in their self-managed super fund. They might also have a family trust that we're not investing for out of that family office group. So, we've got a family office that we provide services to, and there's effectively three parts to the group. We've got the patriarch or the matriarch of the family, which started the business. We've then got the son and his wife, who the son is day-to-day in the business. We run his super fund. We don't deal with his family trust. We don't deal with the mother or her wealth either. She's probably around about 100 million or something like that. And then we've got the son-in-law, who used to be a CFO or Chief Operating Officer for a listed company, now involved in that business. And we're dealing with his super fund. And then we know of his family trust, we know of the broader operations there. We might deliver an investment into that family trust, but we're not dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. So identifying our client is relatively simple. It is the trustees of those two super funds, individually, treating them completely separate.
Okay, very good. So one on self-managed super fund and properties. If property in self-managed super funds are less attractive going forward, with issues in pension phase, is the genuine scope for self-managed super funds much lower?
Brad, I might pass this one to you. You talked about property a lot.
Yeah, that's it. Look, I think there's always going to be a role for it. Everyone in this room would know the client type that wants to just take control of what they're doing a little bit more, and wants to feel busy and important. Pardon my cynicism a little bit. So I think there still will be, especially under that $3 million cap, assuming that all goes ahead. But we all know that self-managed super funds have been problematic, especially in regards to property, the moment that a person retires, especially once they get past 75 years old. The number of clients of a certain age that I can't give financial advice, but saying, this one property you've got in your self-managed super fund is inappropriate, especially now that we're upping the minimum pension percentage. So I don't think it's going to be a new issue, really, and I still think they'll be relevant just because they're attractive to a certain brand of investor.
Okay, very good. Now I've got some questions that have been voted up, so I'll talk about those ones. For the ATO targeting families, do you know what the approximate wealth of the bottom of the top 5,000 is?
I'd say we're talking that 50 million plus at this stage. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And how important do you think is to provide wholesale type products to these high net worth clients?
Oh, how important is it to provide wholesale product? I guess. I mean, direct equities is not a wholesale product. Quite often, what do they want? It doesn't need to be complex. Quite often, I focus on keeping it actually quite simple. So, investing directly, be it even listed hybrids, an Aussie equity portfolio, using some managed funds. Quite often, it's really not that complex. You don't need to sell them a wholesale, complex, structured product. I'm not sure how many people advised through the GFC, but a lot of those structured products blew up. And we often remind clients, you have to remind people that these products are not without risk. They're built to, be risk management tools, but they have an inherent risk in them, and the biggest winner on those products is the product issuer quite often. So yeah, simplicity is often better than providing a wholesale product. I mean, we do provide wholesale, product to those clients, but it's not because they specifically demand a wholesale product. It's a solution. It's part of the asset allocation mix that we're trying to target for that client.
We might try and end with a philosophical question. So with respect to high net worth clients, why do you think we're still so focused on AUM and funds under management when we should be looking at assets under influence, so like business assets and properties and cross generations, etc.? What are your thoughts on that?
Brad, do you want to touch on that at all? I'm happy to, but look, certainly, when you're dealing with a client and you get to know their broader circumstances, yes, you certainly do have an influence over those other assets. Time and time again, we've seen clients that come to you, they've got $20 million in property and about, a few $1,000s in liquid assets, and they've got some spare cash. They're like, what should we do? And I'm sitting there going, you should sell some properties because interest rates are about to go up. Oh, I couldn't possibly do that. We've done so well out of those properties over the last 30 to 40 years, whilst cap rates have been compressing and interest rates have been coming down. And yet they'll still go and buy another property because that's what they know best. But yes, you do get into a position over time where you can influence those decisions, and it's important to provide guidance around your knowledge of the economics, other asset classes that are available to them that they haven't been exposed to, so they're not educated. Providing that education about other simple asset classes, such as a managed fund. A simple index managed fund would have helped these clients out. They didn't become a client because they chose to go and buy another property, and then that was well before interest rates actually rose, but I'd been talking to them about this, and then interest rates have gone through the roof. So they bought at the peak of the property market and, dare I say, have not done so well out of that. But I'm sure they'll hold on to it.
All right, thank you, Chris and Brad. Thank you for sharing your insights and answering some tough questions.